Welcome to Concepts in Chemistry. In this talk, we will discuss density. To start, we have three objects. Which of these objects is the most dense? I'm sure some of you are thinking iron, and some may be thinking additional information. If you wanted additional information, this is additional information. So as you can see, we still have the same three objects, and we do have their corresponding mass, and we do have their corresponding volume. Now, as you can see, they all occupy the same amount of space, so 1 cubic centimeter of space. But they do have varying mass. But if you look closely, you notice that iron has the most mass, and then wood has the least mass. So clearly, it makes sense that iron is the most dense. But why is it that they all occupy the same amount of space, but iron is the most dense? To make sense of this, let's examine how the atoms pack in each substance at the molecular level. So here we do have particle models. So here we have a particle model of iron, particle model of glass, and then particle model of wood. We've used the same size square to depict the same size volume. So clearly, as you can see, in iron we do have lots of iron atoms, and these iron atoms are closely packed with little empty spaces between them. In glass, we do have fewer atoms than we have in iron, and these atoms are loosely packed with some empty spaces between them. And in wood, we still have fewer atoms compared to glass and wood, and these atoms are loosely packed with lots of empty spaces between them. So as you can see, it makes so much sense that iron is the most dense, because among these three objects, iron do have lots of iron atoms packed in this given amount of space, so which makes sense that iron is the most dense. Now clearly, as you see, there's a relationship between the amount of atoms packed in a given space. And if you recall, mass is the amount of matter packed in a substance. And this packing normally takes place in a three-dimensional space, which we call volume. So what is the relationship between mass and volume? To figure this out, just imagine that we have 6 different iron blocks. And these iron blocks also have varying mass. And once they have varying mass, they also have varying volume. So we decided to plot a graph of mass versus volume. So when we plotted the data on the graph, a straight line emerged. So what does this straight line tell us? This straight line tells us that there's a linear relationship between mass and volume. So what this means is that as mass increases, the volume also increases. Okay. So what is the slope of this line? To find the slope of this line, we just have to pick any 2 points at reasonable distance on this line. So once we pick these points indicated with the red lines, and then we trace to the mass axis as well as the volume axis, and then calculate the change in mass and then the change in volume, and then divide the change in mass over the change in volume, then we'll get the slope. So what does this slope stand for? This slope actually stands for density. So density, as you can see, is mass over volume, and it's unique to every substance because the way the atoms pack in every substance is different. Okay. So having said this, let's now formally define density. So what is density? Density is a measure of how atoms pack tightly in a given space. So mathematically, density is expressed as D equal to mass over volume. So to get the density of an object, or to calculate the density of an object, you have to measure its mass and measure its volume and divide the mass by volume to get density. Okay. So usually density is reported in units of grams per mole or grams per cubic centimeters. Okay. Now there are some things to pay attention to about density. One of them is that density is an intensive property, while mass and volume are extensive properties. So why is density an intensive property? Density is an intensive property because it doesn't depend on the amount of substance you have. Okay, so if you go back to the graph, we had 6 different iron blocks. But when we plotted the masses of these blocks with their corresponding volumes on the graph, the slope of the graph was constant, came out the same way. So regardless of the amount of iron you have, the density is always the same. So because of that, we say density is an intensive property, and you can always use density to identify a substance. Okay. Mass and volume are extensive properties because they depend on the amount of substance. Okay, so the more of something you have, the more mass there is. Okay, or the more volume there is. Okay, so that is it. So density is an intensive property, while mass and volume are extensive properties. Density is also affected by temperature. Why is that? Now, if you think about it, density is all about how atoms pack in a given space. Now, since atoms are always vibrating, there's energy inherent in atoms, and this energy also is directly related to temperature. So the kinetic energy of atoms is directly related to temperature. As the temperature goes up, the kinetic energy also goes up. So the more energy they have, the more they vibrate. So the higher the temperature, the more the atoms vibrate. And once they vibrate a lot more, that means that the distance between them is going to increase. So clearly, if the distance is going to increase, that means that the volume is going to increase slightly. Okay. So similarly, if the temperature is lower, then that means that these atoms will vibrate a lot less because they won't have much more energy. So they will move much more closer to one another. So clearly, the distance between them is going to decrease, and it's also going to affect the volume. So the volume is going to decrease slightly. Okay. So as a result of that, when you look at density values in science handbooks, they always report them alongside the temperature at which they were determined. Okay, just to at least show that density is affected by temperature. So you have to report the density value as well as the temperature at which the density was determined. Okay. So these are key things to keep in mind. So density is an intensive property. Because of that, we can use density to identify a substance. And also, density is affected by temperature.